Welcome and thanks for joining us. My guests today are David Knox, the Group Vice President and Chief Technology Officer at Oracle Public Sector. Jonathan Phoebus is the Deputy Director for the Governance and Enterprise Management Services Division at the Nuclear Regulatory Commission. Sukhvinder Singh is the Chief Technology Officer at U.S. Agency for International Development. Ghulam Shakir is Systems Architect at the National Archives and Records Administration, and Eddie Tejeda, Director of Cloud.gov at the General Services Administration. And great to have you all here. And we'll start with you, Jonathan. The policy of Cloud First has morphed into Cloud Smart, which presupposes that cloud is here to stay and it's something that agencies are developing into. Yet there's still a long way to go in terms of numbers of agencies, workloads, and so forth, data center consolidation. So given the Cloud Smart era that we're in, how do you begin the journey to the cloud, or how do you continue it in a new policy era and some more maturity in the government about cloud?
So it's always a good time to move to the cloud, and it's never a good time to move to the cloud. You just have to pick a workload that makes sense, something that is visible, something that will not cause major disruptions to the mission if it does fail, and be prepared to do some rework. There are a lot of opportunities out there. There are a lot of software as a service offerings out there now, which makes it a little bit easier to get your toes dipped into the pool, or the cloud as it were. And you don't need to figure out how you're going to build your systems, how you're going to move all of your data, and you don't want to do it 2 months before you run out of hardware support on what's in your data center and expect everything to be up and running perfectly.
And when choosing that workload or that next workload, is that something the IT department alone determines, or do you bring in the program perhaps, or bring in some other elements of the agency that will be affected by it even if they don't have the final say?
It is always good to have some buy-in from your customer before you start moving to cloud. They need to understand that there are going to be changes to the way their application looks, potentially to the way it works, but they also need to be aware of the benefits. So yes, having the customer buy-in is a good first step.
Okay, Sukhvinder.
We started our cloud journey back in 2011. So we started with actually moving our data center from our headquarters in DC to Miami with Terramar. And it all started because we had a whole bunch of issues in DC data center, space being obviously one issue, utilities, power, you name it. I think every other week we used to have some sort of a problem. At the same time, OMB also came out with a 25-point plan, and one was, move to the cloud, push. So we made a decision to move to Google Apps, and that was very successful. Both of those initiatives, projects, they really kicked off our cloud journey, almost 10 years ago.
And so where does it look like today? I mean, if you wanted to move now, what are your selection criteria, and what
So we actually just moved the second phase, I would call it, our data center. We did it in 2017. So now we have our data center in AWS. So compared to 2009 or 10, and now we have a whole bunch of more options, So we did our analysis and, made the decision. So that's how we ended up, in AWS. I would say 98% or even more of our services are in the cloud because we have only one data center, and that being in the cloud is a big deal. And we have bulk of our application development done there. We have 50 plus SaaS, software as a service offerings that we use. So we are very heavy users of cloud, I would say.
Okay, and Ghulam, of course, NARA has so much of everybody else's records, plus all the things that the agency does natively. What does your cloud journey look like?
I would say we are a little bit mature. We have been in the cloud since 2014, and right now, after migrating about quite a few applications into the cloud, right now we are focused on consolidating all the things that we have learned right now in putting together an enterprise cloud strategy and enterprise governance, and looking to do some cost estimation and forecasting. How can we accommodate our future growth in the cloud? And the second part is, I would say, to be where we are, it would not have been possible with the partnership with support from our TAM team and also the support from the vendor, because given the number of services that we have in the cloud nobody can be an expert at one thing. So we always get a deep dive into what would be the right way to move on these solutions and what's the next set of offerings that you should be looking or planning to. So a lot of it has reduced our operational overhead and lets us focus on our mission. Now, finally, we are at a point we are seriously thinking about, the best parts of the cloud, which is looking to do some kind of a pilot in AI, machine learning, or robotic process automation, which would not have been possible, considering that if we had to spend like a capital expenditure to do all of that. So we are at the end where we are trying to leverage some exciting parts of the cloud. So.
Got it. Okay. And Eddie, of course, GSA has been at the center of, you're always deputized for policy carryout by a couple of administrations now. And what's the status of cloud migration, and what are their concerns?
I think one of the key things to understand is that, well, first of all, cloud.gov is a platform as a service, which means that this is a system that tries to simplify as much of the cloud as possible for developers so that teams are able to focus on the higher value aspects of their applications. So I think part of the important thing to realize is that there is no one destination for cloud. There's going to be a range of options depending on the needs of your team. So whether you want a lot of control and you want raw infrastructure as a service and a lot of access to the internals of your applications, that is one strategy that makes sense for some teams. But I think it's also important to realize that there are going to be a lot of other teams that just need to focus on the application themselves and abstract out a lot of that security and compliance. And that's where cloud.gov, I think, really shines, and where we have been able to partner with agencies across the federal government to provide them that level of service.
So is cloud.gov brokering for people, or
Exactly, yes. So cloud.gov is, I think of it as a very thin security and compliance layer that you can then access a range of different services. So we simplify a lot of the procurement, a lot of the security and compliance by accessing it via cloud.gov. Ultimately, the goal is for us to be able to broker services from a range of cloud providers, but right now we're still working on just refining the process of how people access these different services.
Got it. Okay, and David Knox, what are your customers, the multiple people you call on, telling you? What are the pain points, and how are they getting started?
Well, it is a lot about finding those proper workloads and focusing on the mission and not on the IT. That's really what they want to do. The smaller they are, the more they really want to get into the cloud and not have to worry about data centers. But it is a lot about agility. It's a lot about automation and learning to take advantage of those things. Those are the real enablers. But it has been a learning experience for sure, as people in many ways rethink what they want to move, what are the interdependencies between systems. And I think that's the complications that are often there. They start to see latencies, they start to wonder, the experience is almost an all or nothing kind of approach, and you just can't go from nothing to everything instantaneously.
Sure, and in fact, many applications that depend on, say, data gathering, you hear more and more people saying, well, yes, the cloud is definitely part of the data strategy here and part of the application strategy, but we also need edge computing because it's just not practical for all data gathered anywhere to head to the cloud, process, and then head back down. It's expensive, and it can, as David said, can introduce latencies. So is there thinking, would you say, that more about the balance of computing resources, where it used to be data center versus, I don't know, terminals or something? Now it's edge computing, which might be mobile, versus cloud. Jonathan?
That's definitely a thought, because the data charges are one of those unexpected features of cloud service. And figuring out where the data flow is, how much of it's going up, where is it coming back down, and how am I processing it, is definitely something that goes into it. So we have actually looked at some of our modeling programs, they became a very good workload to move up to the cloud because the data starts there, it stays there. When the model is done, it ends there. We don't need to pull it back down. For other things where we know the data is going to end up in other places, we look at an alternate for processing. And sometimes that's the cloud, sometimes it's in our data center, sometimes it's a shared service.
So you really need to almost have an architectural view.
Yes, you do.
Sukhvinder, comment?
For us, latency is a key factor that we account for whatever we do, because half of our users are overseas and they are not in very sophisticated areas where infrastructure is pretty mature. So for us, I think makes sense to address this problem both on the data center as well as in the edge side. So from the data center, what we try to do mostly, our co-location where we have all the interconnect. So if we can have the direct connectivity to these cloud providers, that really cuts down the latency. Then we can just route traffic from our users, at least in the corners, to directly to these service providers. Even from the overseas, when the traffic comes to our co-location, it directly goes to the service providers. On the edge computing, I think that all goes back to how well you can protect that data, on the edge devices. And again, that becomes pretty tricky, being overseas, because there are a lot of other factors. We can't give certain things, certain devices, certain data to certain people. So that's the area I think we are really focusing more now. Just securing our applications, and whether it takes VPN connection back to in some cases, and just push more and more data actually to the edge, where it can be done.
Sure. Ghulam?
Yeah, in terms of the data movement in the cloud, I think the cloud costs are some of the most challenging aspect to it, because there is a one tier of pricing if you're on the edge of your cloud, and then there's the other service. So it's pretty hard to navigate around that, about that different pricing schemes there. So what we have done from the start is try to bring the computing to the data rather than transfer the data in and out. So that's why you avoid large scale data transfer. And for anything that would require a public access, like we have to give a public access to our images or videos or paper or electronic records, we are looking into leveraging CDNs, and that is basically a vertical capability that's most of the cloud providers offer now. So we are looking to leverage that.
That's kind of a distributed situation where the processing is localized?
Yeah, the data processing, like you bring the computing to the data so to avoid the data movement, and for anything that needs to go out, leverage content delivery networks there to avoid the latency.
Yeah, so it sounds like we've hit on something people are really pondering here. Eddie?
Well, actually, I'll just clarify. We've sort of hopped around here a little bit. Is this a question about
edge versus cloud, and how you architect that and how you balance the costs?
I think this is something that is not as relevant for our applications. Many of our applications are natively on the cloud. So because we are generally working with projects that are just developing, that are in the early stages of development, I think there's always a sense that an understanding that the application is going to be online. So this is not something that cloud.gov specifically is focused on, but I'm very curious to hear more of the panelists' ideas on this.
There's definitely a bifurcation between legacy workloads and how they're architected and brand new stuff developed in the cloud, which we can go into a little bit more after we take a break, but that's what I think you're driving at.
Absolutely, yes. I think that's something that you always have to take into account for specific situations, but again, I don't know if that is necessarily a situation that cloud.gov is particularly focused on right now. We are generally focused on delivering services that are public-facing, that are not necessarily always connected to the back end.
Sure. David, comment on that whole question, because
Yes.
as an application provider also.
Yeah, one of the critical factors, we haven't talked about it yet, is security. And people are very concerned about where their directories are, what type of information. And a lot of what we're starting to see isn't just edge computing and put stuff in the data center, but it's how do I protect, the authentication, the auditing, and then how do I marry that with what the cloud service provider is doing? So that's starting to see a pretty consistent pattern with people keeping on site those parts of their architecture and then pushing out the other stuff.
And when it's on site and you're consolidating data centers, what are the implications for the data center then?
Yeah, well, they're actually pretty used to, I think it's a comfort level as well, right? They know where it is, they know the people, they can come in and hug their server if they want to, make sure it's okay if it's under duress. So there's still a lot of concern about what would happen if we make the decision to move that and something bad happens there. Was that the right decision?
Okay, well, lots of details we're going to follow up on, but right now we're going to take a break. I'm your moderator, Tom Temin, on this panel discussion, The Journey to Delivering the Mission in the Cloud, sponsored by Oracle, here on Federal News Radio, part of the Federal News Network.